Greetings, this is M Squared, and today we're going to talk about some properties of real numbers. These are the properties you'll usually see at this level, and the book usually asks you to name that property or to give an example of the property. So we're just going to run through. I'm going to kind of tell you how I remember the properties. Commutative property. It can be addition or multiplication, and that's pretty obvious. Either there's an addition sign or you know two numbers are being multiplied. How I remember that one is I look at the first part of the word, which is commute. If I go from home, if I commute from home to school, then at the end of the day I go from school to home. So you'll see that the order of the variables here, if this was school, then this would represent home, and if this is home, this would represent school. So it's kind of the same exact thing on both sides, but the order has switched. That's how you can remember commutative. The order switches. Associative property, you'll notice the order is exactly the same, but it's what's in parentheses changes or what's done first. And I kind of remember that if I was at a party and I'm B, and sometimes I might talk to A, sometimes I might talk to C. So we can all be in the same room or on the same side, the order stays the same, but sometimes you're associating with one person and sometimes you're associating with another person. That's how I remember that one. Identity. I remember the identity one because I think of if I look in the mirror, who do I see? I keep my identity. I don't see someone else, I see me. So a number has to keep its identity no matter what happens. So the only way a number can keep its identity in addition is if you add a 0 to it, because when you add a 0, nothing happens. It keeps its identity. In multiplication, it's when I multiply by 1 that I keep my identity. So that's how I remember the identity property. The inverse property is kind of, is kind of associated with the identity property. And what that means is that the inverse property is how I get that identity element. So since 0 was the identity element for addition, what do I add to A to get 0? Well, the opposite of A. That's how I get 0 when I add things that are opposites. 5 and -5, or 4 and -4, -2/3, and a +2/3. That's how I get 0. And over here, it's how I get the identity element 1, which was the identity element for multiplication. So what could I multiply a number by to get 1? And that's always the reciprocal of that number. So if it was 4, it'd be 1/4. If this was a fraction, if A was a fraction, if it was 2/3, then it'd be 3/2. You just flip the number. That's called the reciprocal. So those are the four main properties. Closure is talking about when you have a system that's closed, then when you add or multiply in that system, you only get things that are in that system. And you see that all over in nature. Two dogs, when they breed, they have dogs. They don't have cats or chickens or elephants. So if I have a real number and I add it to a real number, I can only get a real number. If I have a real number and I multiply a real number by a real number, I get a real number. So it's a closed system. That's what that means. And that's probably not one that they'll ask you for an example of, but that's how that one goes. Distributive property of something you've probably been doing for a few years, and that's when you have two or more things inside a parenthesis with one thing on the outside. That means multiplication when there's no sign and the letter or the number is right next to the parenthesis, and so we multiply through. So A times B, AB, and A times C, AC, and the addition, of course, stays there. So now we're going to just go through some examples and figure out which property we're dealing with. Well, anytime there's a plus sign and a 0, and the number keeps its identity, then we know that that's the identity property of addition. And I'll abbreviate there. You can write it out on your paper if your teacher wants you to do that. This one, 4 times 3, is the same as 3 times 4. Well, we have the same thing, but the order switched. So that means our commutative property, which, since it's being multiplied, is of multiplication. And I'm using that because I don't want to use x and confuse us with variables. Over here, 5 times x plus 10 equals 5 times x plus 2. So whenever you have a parenthesis on one side and not on the other, you're pretty sure it's distributive property, but you can check to make sure. But that is distributive property because 5 times x is 5x and 5 times 2 is 10. The next property, we notice 5x times y equals 5 times x times y. The order didn't change, but what is it being associated with x changes. First it's being associated with 5 and then with y. So that's the associative property of multiplication. And on this one, we're adding opposites. So that's the inverse property of addition. And on this one, I'm multiplying by 1. And whenever I multiply 1, nothing changes. The number keeps its identity. So that's the identity property of multiplication. Good luck naming the properties. This is M Squared signing out.